UFC returns from an off week this week with 10 straight events planned over the next 10 weeks. Let's get right back into the circus, starting off with UFC Houston, which has 14 fights scheduled, headlined by a high-stakes middleweight matchup between former champion Sean Strickland and the streaking Anthony Fluffy Hernandez. We got a solid co-main event as well with Jeff Neal taking on Earl Schmedich in a fight that is surely to produce a finish. Can't wait to break down this card for you guys, so let's get right into this bad boy. First fight up, we got in the women's flyweight division as we have Juliana Miller coming in at plus 525, going up against Carly Judice, who comes in at minus 700. Starting off on the Miller's side of things, she did pull off an upset last time around as she took out Ivana Petrovic. After a slow start in the first round, Miller was finally able to get to her grappling in the second and third rounds, and that was enough for her to secure a unanimous decision victory over Petrovic and cash as a plus 200 underdog. That was almost a 2-year layoff she had coming into that Petrovic fight, and she showed a lot of improvements, specifically in her strength and her ability to just implement that grapple heavy and that smothering grappling approach, and she was successful in doing so. She used to train out of, I believe, Team Oyama in that California, NorCal region. I believe that's where it is roughly. But before the Petrovic fight, she moved up to Washington and she started training with Sick Jitsu, which is head coached by Rick Little, has been known for fighters like Michael Chiesa and even Juliana Pena, former champion. So it was a solid fit for Miller, considering a lot of those fighters are grapple-heavy fighters, just as Miller is, so they're able to help her figure out exactly how to implement her style and be successful with it. That allowed her to snap a 2-fight losing streak where she was getting outstruck by Veronica Hardy and then eventually lit up and finished by Luana Santos right after that. She's a mediocre striker. You know, she's like a string bean frame with her long, lanky limbs, which obviously helps in her grappling game. But when it comes to the striking game, she's a little bit wide. She's a little bit looping. She can be countered very easily. But once she gets a hold of that body lock and she can get those double unders, from there she does a great job in terms of throwing her opponents, tripping her opponents, ending up in that top position, or even ducking under, getting to the back of her opponents and hopping onto their back and either sinking in that rear naked choke or putting in the body lock and getting a solid control time there, which is what she was able to do against Ivana Petrovic. Again, she leaves a lot to be desired in the striking realm, and I think that's why she ended up losing to Hardy and Santos, and that's why she's really up against it here in Carly Judice, who's currently riding a 2-fight winning streak, both of those wins coming by knockout. Now, she got onto the UFC roster through the Contender Series, although it was a split decision loss to Anessa Karaskate. Very close fight. Both women landing, I believe it was like 300 or 400 combined total strikes over the course of 15 minutes. They all left it out on the cage, and that's why Dana White decided to sign both of the ladies. And unfortunately for Judy, she had a rude awakening to the UFC as she went up against Gabriela Fernandez in a if you looked at the numbers, it was a close fight. But when you watch the fight, you see the more emphatic shots being landed by Fernandez, and that was enough for the judges to give her that fight. And that's kind of been my issue and my qualm and my critique of Judice's game is she throws with a lot of technique. She throws with good finesse. She has good timing, good range management, but she just doesn't have enough sting on her punches. We know she has head kicks, right? She trains out of a gym in Louisiana called Head Kicks MMA. It's head coached by former UFC fighter Aaron Phillips, but you can see the slickness in her striking, but she just doesn't have enough sting on her punches, and that often makes her fights seem a little bit closer than they should be. But in her last 2 fights, she's showing off the sting. She's showing off the power, which is why it's translating to these finishes. First, I went over Younessi Dubain. That was a squash match, if we've ever seen one. We obviously know Dubain not really deserving of being in the UFC. I think she head kicked her in the first round. And then the Nicole Cagliari fight, she did a great job showcasing her takedown defense, keeping that fight upright, getting right back to her feet if she did get taken down, not settling for bad positions. And then when she got back out into space. She did a great job in terms of just picking Cagliari apart, and that led to that third round finish. I believe it started with the body shot, and then from there she was able to get the finish. She's a very talented striker. She's only 26 years old, so there's plenty of time for her to still grow into this frame of hers and grow into being a total mixed martial artist. And I think this matchup here against Juliana Miller is going to be another matchup or another circumstance where we can see how far along she's coming and if she can do a good enough job in terms of keeping this fight upright. Miller is surely going to be crashing the pocket with wide, reckless shots, hoping to get that body lock and dragging Judice to the ground, which I think she'll be successful in doing here and there. But for the most part, I've been impressed with Judice's grappling defense, and I expect her to continuously get back to her feet, make Miller work in the striking realm, and then eventually line up a TKO, probably in the second or third round as Miller's confidence starts to falter and fade. That's where I think Judice can really take advantage of her. With that said, minus 700 on Judice is a little bit tough. If she can't get away from the grappling of Miller, I think she's kind of screwed. But I think Judice is able to get away from the grappling, get to her striking, land that knockout. The under 2.5 is already at minus 180, which kind of makes a lot of sense here because people believe Judice can start her. But I would rather take that than the minus 700 money line on Judice. So I'm going to start off this card with a big favorite getting the dub here with Carly Judice winning by knockout. Next up in the featherweight division, we got Jordan Leavitt coming in at plus 315, going up against Yadir Del Valle, who comes in at minus 380. Starting off on the Leavitt side of things, he is coming off of a dominant submission victory over Kurt Hollabaugh, and that was a fight where he was returning from action after a year and a half. He was able to do a great job in terms of getting that fight into on the mat. Obviously, we know Hollabaugh, horrible takedown defense. Hollabaugh was able to initiate a bit of a scramble, and in that scramble, we saw Leavitt snatch onto that anaconda choke and put Kurt Hollabaugh completely out. Now, Hollabaugh, like I said, poor takedown defense, but he is a BJJ black belt. So for Leavitt to be able to submit him and put him out cold is obviously very impressive. This is a guy that I've kind of, hammered on for a long time ever since getting into the UFC, that I don't think he's UFC level. But somehow, some way, he always finds a way to get fights into the grappling realm, and that's where he is most successful. I'm not a big believer in his wrestling, but has a way to finagle himself into grappling situations, whether it's pulling guard or getting the fight into the clinch position, pushing off the cage, jumping on the back of his opponent. He's always able to find a way to get the fight into the grappling realm. But if he can't, or he's fighting a superior grappler like we saw with Paddy Pimblett and Chase Hooper, he often finds himself in trouble. He does have some deceiving knockout power like we saw when he finished Victor Martinez, but again, all in all, I just do not think he's all that great of a fighter. He trains out of Syndicate MMA, mediocre striking, a lot of kicks. We see that with a lot of grapplers. If they're not comfortable in the striking game, they throw a lot of kicks to try to maintain the range, keep their head safe, stay on the outside line, throw those kicks, and then eventually mix in a takedown attempt or at least a clinch initiation. And then from there, that's where they're often able to get to the clinch game or the grappling game. And that's usually the style that we see from Jordan Leavitt. A guy still 30 years old. Kind of surprising he's only 30 years old, considering I feel like we've seen him, fighting at this level for quite a long time. It just seems he hasn't been all that active. Now he's going up against Yadir Del Valle, who's 10-0. He's now 2-0 in the UFC, but his last fight is the one that was shrouded in such controversy. If you guys remember, that was the Isaac Dalgarian fight, I believe from November, where there was a lot of red flags going along with the line movement there. Del Valle, I believe, ended up closing as a favorite after opening as a big underdog, and not to mention his first round prop got hammered to smithereens by the public, and that raised a lot of alarm bells for the UFC. So much so to the point that they were forced to go into the locker room of Isaac Dalgarian before the fight took place to ask him if there was something suspicious going on, and he goes, nothing. I'm going to go out there, I'm going to smash this guy, and I'm going to get the win. But we end up seeing that Dalgarian gets tapped out in the first round. The first time in his career he got finished. Not a good look. Obviously a lot of suspicion there. And then we know the whole story where Dalgarian gets cut, whatever. And all the while, Del Valle's out here, celebrating. Credit to him. He went out there and he did what he was supposed to do. Whether he was in on it or not, I don't think he was in on it at all. I think he just went out there and applied the usual pressure that we often see from him. He is a guy that loves to move forward, throw nothing but heat in all of his strikes, look for the takedown, and then try to smash his opponent from that top position. submission. He's very strong, and I love his ability to just stay consistent with that pressure as well. Even when his body language doesn't look the greatest deeper in fights, he still has that gear, that next gear that he can kick it into to really start to pull ahead against his opponents. His Dana White Contender Series fight, which earned him the contract, even though he won by decision, he was putting the pressure and beating on his opponent so much so that Dana still loved what he saw from Del Valle. Even though Del Valle did not get the finish, it was still enough for Dana to be like, let's get this guy in the UFC. And he showcased with 2 back-to-back finishes now. Albeit the second one being a little bit of a controversy and having an asterisk beside it, he is showing that he deserves to be at this level. I believe he trains out of Texas. Very solid fighter all around, and has a lot of potential, and still only 29 years old. Now, here in this fight against Jordan Leavitt, we're going to be seeing Leavitt look to create a little bit of chaos to try to get this fight to the ground. I think Del Valle is pretty much better everywhere. Maybe you give Leavitt, a notch up on the pure jiu-jitsu game, but every mixed martial arts fight starts in the striking realm, and that's where I think Del Valle will have a huge advantage, but also straight up wrestling and straight up strength, I think Del Valle crushes Leavitt. So I think that we'll see Del Valle utilize his grappling defensively, torch Leavitt on the feet, and I think that eventually leads to a Del Valle knockout victory here. I don't mind the chalk on him at all. I just don't think that Leavitt is at his level. Sure, Leavitt has a better strength of schedule, but I think Del Valle has gone out there and done exactly what he's needed to do against the level of competition put against him, and I think we see that ring true once again this weekend. So I'm going to go Yadir Del Valle inside the distance, more than likely the finish coming by TKO. All right, moving over to the welterweight division now. We got Phil Rowe coming in at plus 175 going up against Jean-Paul Lebosnoyani, who comes in at minus 205. Now, starting off on the Phil Rowe side of things, he is coming off of a decision loss against Seok-Hyun Ko, and that obviously did not allow Rowe to build upon the momentum that he had coming out of the Ange Losa fight. He is now 1-3 in his last 4 fights, 2-3 in his last 5 with that knockout victory over Nico Price to kick off that 5-fight run. But we are seeing where he struggles and where fighters can still take advantage of him, and that is often with the grappling game. Getting that top position, keeping him on his back, either finding that submission or keeping him there where he doesn't really have many options to work back to his feet. We saw Neil Magny pretty much outwork him. We saw Jake Matthews have a competitive matchup, but really in that 3rd round start to pull away with his grappling. We saw Ange Losa control most of those first 2 rounds with his grappling, but end up gassing out, and Rowe was able to rely on his own cardio advantage and then pull off that barrage of shots to get the TKO in the 3rd round. But then we saw the Seok-Hyun Ko fight where Rowe had no answer for the takedowns and top pressure of Ko. I think Ko mustered up almost 13 minutes of control time, about 4 minutes in each round, keeping Rowe on his back and not allowing Rowe to have any success of his own. Rowe is a guy who does his best when he can get his range, utilize his length and reach. He's 6'3" with an 80-inch reach at welterweight, which often means he's going to be the longer and taller fighter, but he hasn't been the best in terms of implementing that range against most of his opposition. He feels he looks uncomfortable when he's constantly being pushed back or when he's constantly being wrestled, and he often has to lean on his cardio to hope that his opponent will gas themselves out trying to work for a finish, and that's where we saw the Ange Losa result play out the way that it did because Rowe had a little bit more left in the gas tank. All in all, I just don't think he ever reached his potential. He's 35 years old, so he's obviously up there in age. It's not going to get any easier for him, especially with the way the UFC seems to be matching him up. And they are matching him up with a very tough fighter making his UFC debut here in Jean-Paul Lebosnoyani. Now, Lebosnoyani is on a 4-fight winning streak, the most important victory of his career coming in his last fight against Jack Congdon, where he was able to get the knockout win, I believe 60-something seconds into that matchup. Very quick knockout. It was a beautiful head kick, right hook combination that put Congdon out in 68 seconds it was, and that earned him a contract right away. This California native is a black belt in BJJ, but we are seeing him be more comfortable in the striking range, especially with how crafty and slick he's been able to be with his kicking game. But earlier in his career, we saw him be a little bit more desperate with his takedowns, trying to implement that BJJ heavy game, and it's worked out with against a lot of opponents. The only one that he really seemed to struggle with was Jacoby Jones, who stopped the takedowns, kept the fight standing, and then really start to wear down a dwindling Lebosnoyani. But since then, we've seen some great work from JP. I like to call him JPL. Great work in terms of finishing his next 3 out of his 4 opponents, showcasing great cardio, a good gas tank as well. And he really benefits from having a solid, close-knit team, which includes even former UFC fighter Bruno Souza. And they're doing a great job in terms of morphing this guy into being the best version of himself. And he's only 27 years old still, right? He's very talented in the grappling game, and now if he's continuing to apply that to his striking game so that he can get to his grappling a little bit easier, he's going to be even more difficult to deal with in the UFC. Now, in my opinion, there's a good reason he's a minus 205 favorite. It is constantly where I, break down fights, even this year. I think it was the Alex Morono and Neal Donchenko fight. I usually am apprehensive about some fighters that come into the UFC, either on winning streaks or they're undefeated at chalk against UFC veterans who end up finding themselves as underdogs, just as Phil Rowe does here. But there are certain matchups where I feel like stylistically, the chalk is justified. And I feel like this is one of those situations where the chalk is justified. I think we'll see JPL smother Rowe in terms of not allowing Rowe to get comfortable at range. I know that Rowe is going to have a 4-inch height and an 8-inch reach advantage. Obviously, that will be detrimental for a lot of fighters, but I think Lebosnoyani will do a good enough job in terms of crowding the space, working to his takedowns, and then utilizing his superior BJJ game to try to get the best of Rowe. I ultimately think JPL gets a dub in his UFC debut, and I think it comes by submission. Next up in the welterweight division, we have Brahimaj coming in at minus 130, going up against Punahele Soriano, who comes in at plus 110. Starting off on the Brahimaj side of things, he's riding a 3-fight winning streak, and I believe a lot of that has to do with him moving his training camp from Fortis MMA down in Texas all the way up to Chicago alongside Valle Flow System, where he trains alongside the likes of Ignacio Bahamondes and former welterweight champion Belal Muhammad. But Brahimaj used to be this guy that would just go balls to the wall from jump, looking to implement his aggressive BJJ game and try to finish his opponents within the first round. Now he's being a little bit more calculated. He doesn't just empty his gas tank right off jump, but he looks to actually implement his striking and then from there either pull out poor takedown attempts like we saw from Billy Ray Goff or just wear his opponents down with his own takedown defense and then really just battering his opponents and opening up submissions like he did against Austin Vanderford. He was struggling in the first round of that Vanderford fight in terms of working back to his feet, but he did a good job in terms of constantly working to the cage and keeping his head higher than Vanderford, and that allowed him to not allow Vanderford to establish a dominant position, nor allow Vanderford to get off on too many hard shots. On the scorecards, Vanderford did win the first round on all 3 scorecards, but it cost him his gas tank, right? We saw him start to slow down a lot in that second round, and that's where Brahimaj start to open up more with elbows to the temple, and then eventually that submission attempt, which led to the finish. So he is a guy that I believe 11 of his 13 wins have come in the first round. So his last one against Austin Vanderford was only his second win in 7 fights that have at least seen round 2. So he's slowly getting better in terms of being more effective as we start to get into deeper rounds. And his cardio is looking pretty great too, alongside that takedown defense. So he continuously fights guys that are looking to take him to the ground, but his grappling defense, his cardio is starting to look better and better, and that's starting to produce more of these wins. Now he's going up against Punahele Soriano, who's doing a great job in terms of implementing his style to the welterweight division. This is a very tough cut for him to make, which is why we don't see him fighting as often as he normally does. But when he is, he's been nothing but perfect. He's now 3-0 since moving down to 170, finishing Uros Medic in the first round, and then grinding out both Miguel Baeza and Nikolai Veretennikov. We've either seen him lean on his power punching approach, which has helped him be successful even at 185 pounds, but at 170 pounds, with him being a lot bigger than his opponents, he's able to implement some of his wrestling background and be effective in terms of holding his opponents down. luckily for him, even when he shows bad body language in deep water, he can get to his takedowns against the guys he's been going up against, and those guys end up falling short. They end up settling for bad positions, and Soriano is able to catch his breath while he's laying on top of them, and then add up some more damage to keep the fight on the ground and eventually see the scorecards to get his hand raised there. He's a fun fighter when he lets his hands go. He's not the most aggressive wrestler in terms of landing ground and pound and trying to get opponents out of there. He doesn't often threaten with submissions either, so I think that's kind of constricting his game from that top position. He's just working so hard to keep guys down, and then the only thing he really has to threaten with in terms of finishes is when fights are in the striking realm, when he throws his big bombs, his overhands, his right straight down the pipe as well. That's where he is most dangerous in terms of actually finishing his opposition. But I think he's going to struggle to do that here against Ramiz Brahimaj. And, going into this, I was kind of surprised to see Brahimaj as the slight favorite. But when you think about it more and more, and you watch both of their fights, I think Brahimaj has good grappling defense, or at least good enough grappling defense to make Soriano continuously work to keep him down. And then from there, I think Brahimaj can lock up a submission and force the tap. I like the under 2.5, which is roughly around the same price as that Brahimaj money line. So I think that kind of makes sense here, because I think if Brahimaj wins, probably comes by submission. If Soriano is able to land his big power, which is possible, in that first round, the under 2.5 still cashes. But I'd be surprised if Soriano can really wear Brahimaj down with his wrestling and keep that top position and grind him out over 15 minutes. I know Themba Gorimbo was able to do it against Brahimaj, but I think we're seeing a change in mindset from Brahimaj ever since moving over to Chicago. So look for him to make Soriano work for those takedowns, eventually catch him in a submission and force him to tap. So the official prediction will be Brahimaj by submission. All right, moving over to the next fight here in the women's bantamweight division. It is a rematch of a fight that took place in September of 2023 when we had Nora Cornolle, now coming in at plus 250, defeat Jocelyn Edwards, who now comes in at minus 300. Starting off on Cornolle's side of things here, she is coming off of a loss to Carol Hosa in a fight where she had no success trying to get up from the ground. She really struggled with the wrestling of Hosa. Hosa did a great job, especially in the second and third rounds, getting Cornolle to the ground and just keeping her there. Cornolle didn't really have much of an answer to work back to her feet. You have to credit, obviously, the top pressure of Hosa to keep that fight on the ground and keeping Cornolle away from where she feels most comfortable. Cornolle is most comfortable when she can get to her striking game. She comes from a Muay Thai background where she implements combinations, good leg kicks, and good knees, and that's often what we see her start to slow opponents down with, like she did against Melissa Mullins and how she did against Haley Cowan before she eventually was able to sink in that submission victory. But she's coming off against losses against cleaner fighters. 1-2 in her last 3 fights. That first one, a loss to Jacqueline Cavalcanti, who did a good job of outstriking her. And then Carol Hosa, like I said, landing the takedowns and getting that top control, specifically in the second and third rounds. Cornolle is 36 years old, so that's obviously something to keep in mind. And I think for her to be most successful at this stage of her career, a lot of that has to come down to her striking game. She's working on her grappling defense, as we've seen in past fights, but against a certain level of opponent, I don't think it's going to work out all that well for her. She's going up against a streaking Jocelyn Edwards, who's really turned things around as of late. Right now on a 3-fight winning streak, with all 3 of those wins coming by finish. She was able to dominate and finish Tamiris Vidal in the 3rd round with a submission. Then she was able to TKO Chelsea Chandler, and then she quickly put away Priscilla Cachoeira last time around. It was a first-round knockout, very nasty finish with the combination she was able to land and eventually get the TKO win. Edwards has, I believe, ever since Valentina Shevchenko fought Alexa Grasso at Noche UFC, Edwards has been a part of her training camp, and that's where I think we've seen Edwards get a lot more comfortable utilizing a grapple-heavy approach, really establishing that top pressure, threatening with submissions, and really starting to rain down some big shots from there. She's also gotten a lot more confident in her striking game, which I believe was the crux of her style when she first came into the UFC. She throws with a lot of output, she throws with a lot of activity, but she wasn't really landing significant shots to really catch the eye of the judges or even put opponents away. But now with three straight finishes in her last 3 fights, I think it's a sign of her being more and more comfortable now, really working into the experience that she's been able to accrue at the UFC level, and it's starting to pay off for her. With that said, beating Tamiris Vidal, Chelsea Chandler, Priscilla Cachoeira, I believe 2 of those 3 fighters no longer in the UFC, kind of just goes to show, okay, she should do that to those fighters. Maybe earlier in her career, maybe Edwards would just decision those fighters, but the fact that she's getting finishes, I believe goes to show that she is getting better, she is improving, and she's getting more confident in her game. Now here against Cornolle, like I said, this is a rematch of a fight that took place in September of 2023, where we did see Edwards look to implement a grappling game, but she, at the ending of each round, she kept giving up position, and that allowed Cornolle to land a few big strikes, and that swayed a few of the judges to Cornolle's side. Did Edwards still deserve to win that fight? Maybe, maybe not. I wouldn't call it a robbery by any means, because I don't think Edwards was getting off on enough significant shots when she was able to get the fight to the ground. But I think now with her more confident and more aggressive, I think we'll see her look to land more damage rather than just looking to secure position. Even with that said, I don't know if she should be minus 300 here. She was minus 125 the first time they fought. So coming off a loss to her, now she's minus 300. I get the trajectory of both women showcases that Edwards probably should be the favorite here, but should she be all the way up at minus 300? Maybe not. I think she's going to win. I'm not going to try to give Cornolle too much of the benefit of the doubt here. I think we see Edwards win. I think we see her pick her apart, but I think we see her more aggressive with the grappling game, and I think that'll eventually lead to Edwards getting another submission victory here. So I would rather play the Edwards submission prop than to take the minus 300 here, but I think Edward wins by dominating most of this matchup, but specifically in that grappling realm and not giving up position like she did in the first fight. All right, let's move over to this next flyweight matchup. It takes place between, I believe, actually, no, they're not Texas natives. One of them is, and that is Alden Coria, who comes in at minus 270. He's going up against Louis Gurule, who comes in at plus 230. Now, starting off on the Coria side, who came in on short notice back in September for his UFC debut, came in as a decent-sized underdog against Alessandro Costa, and he beat Costa in pretty much every aspect of mixed martial arts. Now, on paper going into that matchup, I thought Coria was the better striker, and that was obviously on display in the first round. In the second round, we saw the fight get into the grappling realm, not so much because of Costa, but because of Coria going for the takedown. And he did get reversed in a certain position, but eventually got back to that dominant position, and he was able to land some big ground and pound that really seemed to break Costa, which eventually led to that early third round finish for Alden Coria. I've had my eye on Coria for a little bit now. He, made his, had a couple fights with the LFA. Then he went over to Fury FC where he pulled off a few upsets and then eventually earned that shot to take on Costa in the UFC, and he made it be known, right? I believe Cameron Smotherman, maybe a training partner or somebody close enough to Coria, had a similar short notice UFC debut against Jake Hadley. If you guys remember that, Smotherman was a big underdog going into that fight, not just because of his debut, but also because of the short notice nature of it, but also because of the seeming grappling gap in his game. But he shut that down completely from Hadley, outstruck him, and won that fight dominantly, and Coria was able to do the same thing here against Alessandro Costa in September. Now he gets a full training camp in front of his home state, hoping to show out and show that he deserves to be at this level with that striking game. He is a training partner of flyweight champion Joshua Van, and I think we see similar patterns in their game where they love to strike, love to set up combinations, rip to the body, and eventually start going high and trying to knock their opponents out. But I was really impressed with Coria's takedown defense and his ability to keep fights standing, which is often where he's shown flaws earlier on in his career. I was going up against Louis Gurule, who is kind of underachieving in my opinion. A guy that I really expected to be successful in the UFC, but through 2 UFC starts, he's 0-2 now. He came onto the UFC scene by going through the Contender series. It was a very short notice matchup where he took on Nick Piccinini, who's a very high-level wrestler, and we saw Gurule make him work a lot, and I think Gurule ended up winning that fight by split decision, earned his contract to the UFC, but now he's come up short in both of his fights. The first one was against Osbourne, who fights later on in this card. And we saw Gurule have a decent first round with good activity, good movement, good output. But in that second round, it seemed he got a little bit lackadaisical, threw a naked kick, got clipped by Osbourne, who we know throws with big power. And from there, he was able to get the TKO finish. And I think that was a big learning experience for Gurule. Then he went up against Jesus Aguilar, a fight I believe Gurule came in as a minus 200 favorite, or even wider than that. But it seemed like Aguilar just had his number a little bit. In the first round, we saw Aguilar throw big heat, land big shots, and I think that was enough for the judges to score that round in his favor. Then in the second round, it was close, but I think that Gurule edged it out ever so slightly. And round 3 was quite competitive, which could have gone either way, but there was a moment at the beginning of that third round where Aguilar seemed to stumble and wobble Gurule, and I think that was the ultimate difference maker there. Gurule is a solid guy, trained originally out of Factory X, but it seems when there was that max exodus from Factory X, with guys like Brandon Royval and Alexander Hernandez leaving the gym, Gurule went with those guys. And he's been training alongside both those guys, ever since then. I think it's been about 2 years at this point in time. But Gurule's, he has a good coaching system around him. He has a good training camp around him. It's just about achieving his potential. Now, athletically speaking, he's not the most gifted. Skill-wise, maybe not the most gifted either, but it's just his ability to fight, his pace, his pressure, never settling for bad positions, constantly working, looking to break his opponents, and then eventually either finish them late or just go on to win fights by decision. Now it's about being a little bit more urgent. We saw him bring that urgency in the second and third rounds against Aguilar, but it still wasn't enough because of that slow start that he had. So I'm hoping that he's learned a few things from those first 2 fights that he can apply into this third one. But arguably speaking, this could be the toughest out of the 3 fights he's had in the UFC. Now, Coria at minus 270 makes some sense here. Obviously, the trajectory of both guys, Corea's on a winning streak, Gurule's on a losing streak. In terms of stylistically speaking, Coria is this faster, more powerful striker, and I think that's ultimately going to help him pick apart Gurule and win this fight on the scorecards. But I'm a little bit hesitant. I don't want to completely write off Gurule. If his durability holds up, if he's able to push a little bit of a pace, if he can corral Coria against the cage, get off on some clinch work, maybe land a takedown or 2, maybe he can have some success there, showcasing his cardio as well. But I just feel whenever Coria is able to get back out into distance, he's going to be able to land his combinations. He's going to be able to land with a little bit more sting. And then at the ending of each round, you're going to be like, Coria was the one that did more damage, so we're going to have to give this fight to him. And I think that's ultimately going to be the difference maker here. I would hold off on Coria at chalk. Again, I think Gurule is being slightly overlooked, but he hasn't done the most in the UFC to really make you believe that he's worth a plus 230 shot either. So official prediction will be Coria by decision, but I'd be a little bit skeptical in terms of taking that kind of chalk on him. All right, next up in the flyweight division, we got Osbourne coming in at plus 110, going up against Alibi Idiris, who comes in at minus 130. Starting off on the Osbourne side of things, he is now 1-4 in his last 5 fights, with that one win being that knockout victory over Louis Gurule. That was a fight where he was down in the first round after being outworked, but luckily he was able to capitalize on a lazy kick from Gurule, drop him, and get the TKO finish. He nearly finished Ronaldo Rodriguez at Noche UFC back in September of 2024 when he nearly finished Rodriguez in the first round, but then Rodriguez rallied back in round 2 and 3 to end up getting the win there. We often see Osbourne struggle in the grappling room. That's where guys have had the best success against him, whether it's Asu Al-Mabayev submitting him, Jafel Filho submitting him, or even Steve Erceg digging deep in the, I believe, third round to get the fight to the ground, second and third round actually, to get Osbourne to the ground and grind him out and win the fight that way. Second round, I think Erceg outpointed him in the striking room. Third round, I believe it was when Erceg actually started to use his grappling. In the first round, Osbourne hurt Erceg, nearly finished him, maybe left a little bit too much in that first round with expending the energy that he did. But that's kind of been the issue in Osbourne's game. He's long, he's athletic for this flyweight division, he has power, he's fast, but that seems to start to fall off after that second round, after the halfway point of the fight, and that's where opponents are usually able to get ahead of him or eventually get him out of there in the second or third rounds. I think it's his athleticism has largely been the reason for his success and why he's still in the UFC after this long. But I still think, you have to give respect to that finishing power, to his frame, to his speed. And that's what Louis Gurule unfortunately found out. He's a guy that I often look to fade, whether it's with the lock of the night play like I did with Ronaldo Rodriguez. I think I had Louis Gurule as the lock of the night against him as well. But you have to respect the power that he brings, which is why sometimes he might be able to spring an upset. I will say this. With him being plus 110 here, he was plus 130 late last week. So a lot of obviously some love coming in on him here. I think a lot of that had to do with him hurting Steve Erceg in the first round of that fight. But then we see the usual Osbourne falling off in the second and third rounds. And that's where I think a lot of people are overlooking and why they're probably betting him and as an underdog here. But we'll talk more about the betting aspect of this fight after I get through Alibi Idris's side of things here now. So Alibi suffered his first pro loss, which was an Ultimate Fighter debut or Ultimate Fighter finale, where he took on Joseph Morales, and Morales showed him no respect. Idiris is normally a guy that does a great job in terms of dictating the pace, landing his combinations, getting to the wrestling whenever he needs to, but Morales was the one that was in the driver's seat of that fight. He was the one pushing Idiris back, keeping him uncomfortable, eventually landing some takedowns. Even if Idiris was the one landing takedowns, Morales reversed it almost immediately or eventually worked back to his feet and then got back on that gas. And then halfway through that second round, we saw Idiris really starting to slow down, starting to give up those positions a little bit more, and then eventually led to Morales getting the submission win. I think that leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths for Idiris in terms of being like, oh, this guy's not that good. He probably shouldn't have been a big favorite against Morales. But I think we're constantly overlooking what Morales brings to the table. He is a guy that's historically been underrated throughout his career, and I think that kind of poured into the Idiris fight. But I think we'll really see what Idiris is made of this weekend. He was undefeated. He won a prominent title over there in Asia under Niza FC, fought some pretty tough competition, finished most of those guys as well. So I really had some high hopes for him when he made it to the UFC. Although he fell short in the Ultimate Fighter, he still has an opportunity to prove himself here now that he's fighting, just as an official UFC bout. Mixed in the fact that he probably had some UFC jitters fighting on a pay-per-view card against Joseph Morales. Now that he's kind of shook that off, now that he can possibly get back to his game, this fight against Osbourne could be very intriguing. Now, if Morales just won by decision and we saw Idiris not have a cardio dump, I think we would see Idiris closer to minus 200 here. You also mix in the fact of Osbourne outperforming the plus 400 price tag that he had against Steve Erceg. Maybe we see this line a little bit wider too. So I think it's a combination of things here that is making this line a lot closer than I think it should be. I don't think Osbourne is going to push as much of a pace as Morales did. I think he'll try to be in Idiris's face. I think he'll try to, poke at him, try to land his big shots early. But the more that he pushes, the worse it's going to be on his gas tank. And I think Idiris will have a better gas tank, and he'll actually be able to rely on his wrestling here, land a few takedowns, or even push Osbourne against the cage and try to suck a little bit of wind there. So I think Idiris won't show as bad of a gas tank as he did last time around against Morales. I think his durability is already top notch. I think he's the better grappler. I think he's the better wrestler. I think technically speaking, he's probably the superior striker. Obviously, finishing, I would give the edge to Osbourne. Obviously, big power in his punches. We have to respect that. But if Idiris can get through that first round without getting clipped and continue to stick with his striking defense and get to his grappling in the second and third rounds, I expect him to dominate Osbourne here. And I think this minus 130 line ends up looking like a steal. Again, he was minus 150 just a few days ago. Now that he's down at minus 130, it's clear that there is Osbourne love coming in, but I think that love is a little bit misguided, and I think Idiris will remind us why. So once again, I'm going to go Idiris and Idiris by decision. Next up in the welterweight division, we got Chidi Njokuani coming in at plus 100 going up against Carlos Leal, who comes in at minus 120. I start off on the Njokuani side, who suffered his first UFC welterweight loss last time around at the hands of Jake Matthews. That snapped a 3-fight winning streak for Njokuani, who was seemingly fitting into the welterweight division pretty well. His range of 6'3" height and 80-inch reach really helps him implement that nasty Muay Thai style, keeping opponents at range, usually staying away from the big punching power, and then getting back to his own striking offense from there. But against Jake Matthews, there's a sneaky trip in the clinch from Matthews, which exposed Njokuani's back, and that eventually led to Matthews slowly working for that rear naked choke and then getting the choke 69 seconds into that first round. Njokuani did a decent job of defending in terms of attacking the hooks, not allowing Matthews to really secure that back position tight enough. But before, I think he may have just waited a smidgen too long to start attacking the hooks, because by the time he did, it seemed like the choke that Matthews had applied was already very tight, and that forced BJJ black belt to tap out. But Njokuani is still talented. I know he's 37 years old, but as he's shown in the Zaleski fight, as he's shown in the Gooden fight, he is able to take some shots here at welterweight, which allows him to be a little bit more confident in terms of throwing his counters. He loves throwing those close range elbows, which obviously deals a lot of nasty damage to a lot of his opponents. He's skilled, and I think even at 37 years old, he still has a lot of high level wins within him. Will he get into the rankings? Will he burst into the top 10? Probably not, but there are certain stylistic matchups that I think we have to give him some credit for, and this could be one of those. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of love come in here against Carlos Leal. Now, let's quickly talk about Leal before we break down this fight completely. Leal came into his last matchup as a massive favorite against Muslim Salikov, showing him no respect as you would expect the odds to. Unfortunately for Leal, overswung a little bit. Salikov counters him, puts him out cold, and Leal ends up suffering a defeat, which now brings his UFC record to 1-2. We know his UFC debut against Renat Fakhretdinov should have likely been a win for Leal, who did a great job in terms of nullifying the grappling of Fakhretdinov and landing more damage, but it seemed like the control time was being scored a little bit more by the judges, and that ultimately handed Leal a loss in his UFC debut. Then after that, he ran through Alex Morono, finishing him in the first round after hurting him pretty quickly, and he expected to do the same thing against Salikov. Unfortunately, it did not pan out for him. He's a power puncher. I think he is best with his Muay Thai. He usually shows no respect for his opponents, walks them down, throws big punches, throws big kicks, and eventually lines his opponents up with a big finishing shot. I wonder what kind of effect that Salikov knockout loss will have on him. Like, it's not like he just got out-grappled like he did against Fakhretdinov. He got put out. You know, his style completely worked against him against Salikov, and he paid for it dearly. Will he be a little bit more reserved here? Is he going to have to crash the pocket more and more here now against Njokuani? You know, being at a 6-inch reach disadvantage, being at a 4-inch height disadvantage as well. Those things obviously come into play. Njokuani, you know, late last week was about plus 150, plus 170. Now he's down to plus 100 because there's a lot of money coming in on the Njokuani side, and I have to agree with it. I think Njokuani is the more skilled striker. I think he's the better BJJ specialist, but even if this fight stays in the striking realm, I believe in Njokuani's ability to eat one or two big shots from Leal and then dish damage back with his own knockout power. I expect this fight to last maybe a round and a half, maybe 2 rounds tops, but I think Njokuani is constantly going to be able to thwart the forward pressure of Leal, land those counters, and eventually one of those big shots will open up a finishing opportunity, and look for Njokuani to get a big win on home turf here as he knocks out Carlos Leal within 2 rounds. All right, moving over to the middleweight division now. We got Zach Reese coming in at plus 140, going up against Michel Pereira, who comes in at minus 160. This is such a fun fight and a great fight to put in front of a crowd like Houston. You know, obviously Reese being a native of the Texas region, so obviously he's going to be enjoying a bit of a home field advantage there. He's coming off of a submission win over Jackson McVeigh. That was a short notice spot for him. That was one where he, came in on short notice, and a lot of people believe that if McVeigh could wear him down, McVeigh could start to run away with this in the second and third rounds, but we saw some great resilience from Reese in that first round. It seemed like he was getting handled in the Muay Thai clinch by McVeigh. McVeigh was landing nasty elbows, good knees, constantly disrupting the base of Reese and just making him pay for it with knees and elbows. He even cut Reese up with a couple of elbows as well in that first round. But in that second round, we finally saw Reese get that takedown, get some nasty shots off from that top position, and then eventually open up the rear naked choke to get the win. Reese is normally a guy that looks to get finishes on the feet. He's nasty with his striking. He has big power, but now that we're seeing him look to get fights to the ground, that's where we see him be quite successful in terms of opening his opponents up with elbows and then eventually threatening with submissions as well. I was impressed with his ability to go 15 minutes against both Jose Medina and Duško Todorovic. Both fights, well, maybe not the Medina fight because of Medina's insane durability, but the Todorovic fight I expected to finish inside the distance, but he showcased a very solid all-around game. He is becoming better and better in terms of managing his gas tank. He's very slick with his submissions, even off of his back. He's a very dangerous striker, which I think is his bread and butter. It's just his durability that I have a little bit of a question mark about, and you expect that's going to be tested here against Demolador Michel Pereira. Now, if you were to tell me last year that Pereira would be on a 3-fight losing streak right now, I would call you crazy. I know he has a plethora of MMA experience. He's coming into his 45th professional or 46th professional fight this weekend, but he's still only 32 years old. But it's really not been looking good for him after he had his 8-fight winning streak snapped and now turned into a 3-fight losing streak. The first of those losses will give him a bit of a pass for, right? He was going up against Anthony Fluffy Hernandez, the man who headlines this card. He got worked through and eventually finished late in that fight. It was the fight after that where I think there's a lot of red flags being raised, where he went up against Abus Magomedov and did not look like himself at all. I recall having him as a lock of the night play against Magomedov because I thought he could stop the takedowns and then start landing big shots and eventually get a knockout. If you look just at the UFC stats, you'd be like, oh, Pereira did land shots. He was throwing and he was landing shots, but even the commentators were able to recognize that we were getting a shell of the version of Pereira that we normally got. And Magomedov was in the driver's seat of that entire fight. Got the takedowns when he wanted, pushed the pace in the striking realm. And, usually a guy that starts to slow down in deeper water, Magomedov looked fine in the entire 15 minutes because Pereira was not providing any threat or any sort of danger to Magomedov, where Magomedov didn't have to stress out or slow down. And then after that, back in August, I think it was, Pereira goes up against UFC returning UFC fighter Kyle Daukaus, and Daukaus finished him in seconds. It was crazy. I think it was 30, 40 seconds, something like that. The only kind of success we saw Pereira have in that fight, he threw a combination, landed a nasty body kick, but it did no damage to Daukaus. And then whenever Pereira was gearing up to throw his next combination, Daukaus clipped him with a counter, put Pereira off balance, and eventually followed up with big shots to get him out of there. So the big question mark becomes, where's Pereira's head at? Is he ready to get back into the cage? Is he ready to take on another challenge here, especially a guy as dangerous as Zach Reese? That's a big, big question mark. I expect this fight to be a car crash for the most part. If somebody goes for the takedown, it will probably be Reese. But if this fight plainly takes place in the striking realm, I expect one of these lights to go out eventually. I think there's going to be a fire under Pereira's ass, especially coming off of 3 straight losses now, to try to save his UFC roster spot and try to get that finish here over Reese. So I think that's why, as days have been going by, we're seeing money come in on the Pereira side. When I researched this fight, he was closer to minus 130. Now he's up to minus 160. And I think for good reason. On paper, I think he's the better fighter, but you can't be fully trusting of what his durability is at and where his mentality is at. But if he comes back looking 80% of what he looked like during his 8-fight winning streak, I think he eventually finds that finisher over Reese. So I'm going to go Pereira. I'm going to go Pereira by knockout, but I didn't mind the under 1.5, which is at plus money. Could still be at plus money at certain books, but I think it's going to end up closing maybe as a, maybe minus 130, minus 140, but I'm expecting a car crash here. Reese normally doesn't go into deep water. Neither does Pereira. You match both these guys up, and considering the losing streak that Pereira's on, maybe we see a little bit more of an aggressive Pereira, and that leads to an early finish. But no matter who wins, the under 1.5 should cash regardless. But my prediction will be Michel Demolador Pereira by knockout. All right, moving over to the welterweight division, we got Jacoby Smith coming in at minus 335, going up against Josiah Harrell, who comes in at plus 275. Now, starting off on the 11-0 Smith side here, who is also representing Texas, he's coming off of a nasty submission win over Nico Price. That was a fight where he nearly finished Price in the first round, but seemed to slow a tad at the beginning of that second round. Seemed like he had to find his footing a little bit. Eventually got the fight to the ground. From there, he was able to land some choppy shots to keep that fight on the ground and eventually find the back of Price and sink in that choke to get the finish. Prior to that, he took a short notice fight against Preston Parsons, which is kind of weird in terms of the fact that Smith had already secured a UFC contract through the Contender Series the year prior, but still decided to make his UFC debut on short notice. But there must have been something he saw in Parsons' game that led him to believe, hey, I could probably make short work of this guy and make it look really good and put a stamp on my UFC rival. And that's exactly what he did. He took 73 seconds to knock Preston Parsons out and showcase to the world that, this is a guy that deserves to be respected, and it could be a blue chip prospect if he especially stays as active as he is right now. He comes from a collegiate wrestling background, a decorated collegiate wrestling background. From there, we saw earlier in his career, he would utilize that to control opponents on the ground, grind most of them out, maybe land some ground and pound on some of them as well. But I believe it was in September of 2023, we saw him start to lean on his striking a little bit more, and that led to back-to-back knockout victories, which earned him that the opportunity to fight on the Contender Series. And from there, he landed another finish and got to the UFC, and now he's been doing nothing, just finishing guys, training under Fortis MMA, training under Saif Saud. It's the perfect coach and atmosphere to bring a guy of the work ethic, the skill set, the wrestling background of Jacoby Smith and try to make him the best version of himself. And he's 30 years old, so he's getting damn near close to his prime, and he's shown all the good things that you would like to see from a fighter of his skill set. But he's going up against a tough, debuting, short notice Josiah Harrell. Now, Harrell is a guy that was originally signed to the UFC back in July of 2023 when he was scheduled to take on Jack Della Maddalena. Unfortunately for him, he failed the pre-fight medicals and he was cut from the UFC immediately because the UFC did not want to take a chance given what he was diagnosed with. Apparently, he was diagnosed with something called moya, which is a rare brain disorder where you don't get enough blood to the brain. And, if his blood pressure was to go high, he would be at risk at suffering a seizure or even a stroke. So the UFC wanted nothing to do with that. So Harrell stayed out of competition for a year and a half. He got corrective brain surgery to make sure that diagnosis would no longer be on his medicals. And he returned with 4 straight wins, finishing 3 of those 4 wins, including a win over former UFC fighter Melvin Gillard. He defeated former LFA champion Keegan Genrich. And then last time out, he had a very solid performance against a very tough Russian opponent, I believe Russian, Kazakh, one of those stands, I believe Bekmir's Dozmatov was from. And I picked Dozmatov to win that fight. I did not think Harrell had fought a guy as good as Dozmatov, but Harrell showed great takedown defense. He was punishing Dozmatov with any moment that he had, and then he really started to pull away in that third round as Dozmatov started to slow down, and we saw Harrell muster up a TKO finish at the end of that fight. His cardio looked on point. His defensive wrestling looked on point. Knowing he comes from a wrestling background as well, he's often the guy that's looking to take opponents down and smash them from that top position. But his striking is also getting more impressive. He's blitzing into these big shots and hurting guys and finishing guys. But what's most impressive has been his cardio. He doesn't train out of a big gym either. He trains out of Ohio. He trains alongside former UFC fighter Matt Brown. They're doing a great job in terms of bringing him along as well. And now he finally gets his opportunity to fight at the biggest stage in the world. And I believe he's more than deserving of it. Credit to him for not having to go through the Contender Series, but rather get signed straight to the UFC. And now he's fighting a killer like Jacoby Smith. Now, the intriguing thing about this matchup is both guys are similar archetypes, right? You would give Smith the edge in terms of a wrestling background, but in terms of pure mixed martial arts, they're kind of the same fighter. They throw big heat in their strikes. If they can't get the knockout, they'll go for the takedown, and from there, they'll look to just smother their opponents or try to get the TKO. What's kind of making me scratch my head is why the line is as wide as it is. Sure, Smith is the better wrestler, but from what I've seen from Harrell, this guy is not going to concede position. This guy is not going to settle for a bad position. So that's going to cause Smith to consistently work. Now, in the past, Smith has gone up against guys where he has a big enough wrestling advantage that if he feels a little bit uncomfortable in the striking game, he can easily take the fight to the ground and start sucking wind there, just like he did against Nico Price. I don't think he'll have the benefit of that here against Harrell, who's going to make him work for takedowns and is not going to let him settle in top position. I think Harrell has stayed in good shape, so even though he's coming in on short notice here, which is still obviously in the back of my head, I think he might be worth a little bit of a shot at plus 275. In terms of an official prediction, I still got to go with Smith considering he's getting a full training camp, his wrestling advantage. Maybe he's able to stay ahead of the scrambles against Harrell, maybe land more damage in those instances as well, but I don't think it should be all the way up at minus 335. Again, these guys are kind of a similar fighter. I'd give Smith the edge in wrestling. I'd give Smith the edge in terms of training camp and coaches and training partners. But Harrell could be one of those guys that, he's undefeated from his entire martial arts career, from his amateur days to his pro days. He hasn't suffered a single defeat, and for good reason. And we saw it on display against Dozmatov. So I would consider Harrell as a small play as an underdog. My prediction would be Smith. My favorite play would probably be the over 1.5. I expect this to be competitive. But maybe Harrell can start running away with this in deep water as Smith becomes uncomfortable not being able to maintain position. So this is a very volatile fight in my opinion. So much so that minus 335 on Smith is unwarranted. But I will pick him to win. I'll pick him to win by decision. Very low confidence, but Harrell is definitely worth a consideration here. All right, moving over to the heavyweight division now. We got Sergey Spivac coming in at plus 130 going up against Delija, who comes in at minus 150. Starting off on the Spivac side of things, he is riding a 2-fight losing streak now at the hands of Jailton Almeida and then most recently against Waldo Cortez Acosta. The Almeida fight, he just couldn't get to his style. Almeida was just the better grappler. He was able to hold Spivac down, eventually get that TKO. Then the Waldo Cortez Acosta fight, couldn't get to his takedowns, ended up getting battered on the feet, and he just couldn't keep up with the more athletic fighter who had better takedown defense than even I was expecting going into that fight. The Polar Bear needs to get fights to the ground. He needs to smother opponents. He's not all that comfortable in the striking game. He's trying to improve that part of his game, but it's not at the point where he can just specifically rely on the striking to end up getting his wins. He needs to get fights to the ground like he had against Derek Lewis, got the submission there against Marcin Tybura. That one was a weird one. That was a rematch, if you guys remember. The first time around, Tybura smothered Spivac and finished him, or I think you beat him by decision. But then in the second fight, it was a fight night main event. Tybura took him to the ground immediately, but it seemed like Spivac was inviting it because as soon as he got taken down, Spivac started threatening with submissions off of his back, which is something we don't often see from heavyweights of his size. But it seemed like he just knew that, okay, I'm going to end up being on my back here, but I got to be very aggressive with my jiu-jitsu. And he caught Tybura in an armbar and he forced a tap. That was very, very surprising, especially considering that Tybura brown belt, black belt in BJJ, I believe. So good fight IQ there from Spivac in that fight, but he hasn't been able to put off a win since that fight. And I think that's starting to go to show what his ceiling is. Earlier in his UFC career, I was willing to give him the benefit of the doubt because he was still young. He was still building his experience inside the game and still fighting, tougher and tougher competition. But we're starting to see when he doesn't have a big enough wrestling advantage, when he's at a big athletic disadvantage, and when he's fighting a better striker who can keep him in the stand-up realm, he starts to fall off quite a lot and ends up either getting finished or just getting outworked. And unfortunately for him, I think he's fighting a guy of that archetype here in Delija. Now, Delija had a solid UFC debut, quickly finishing Marcin Tybura, not showing Tybura any respect, walking him down and eventually getting a quick finish. That was actually a rematch of a fight that took place 10 years prior, and that night, Tybura defeated Delija by TKO injury. Delija injured his leg, similar to an Anderson Silva type of leg break. Very gruesome, nasty leg break that he suffered. And that was actually the last fight for Tybura on the regional scene before getting signed to the UFC. Whereas Delija had to, play it out on the regional scene a little bit more, made it to the PFL, won the PFL, I believe, 2022 tournament. There wasn't a time where he actually got signed to the UFC as well in 2020, but the PFL wouldn't let him out of his contract, so he ended up having to stay with the PFL, which was very, very unfortunate. He was scheduled to go up against Cyril Gane that night, and I think I had that fight was like good to go up until halfway through fight week, and we got some pretty good plus money on Delija, and then the fight ended up getting canceled there. But luckily, he still makes it to the UFC here after a pretty successful run with the PFL. But then unfortunately last time around against Waldo Cortez Acosta, he ended up coming up short. That was one of those weird fights and those weird situations where Delija finished Waldo Cortez Acosta. Apparently he poked him in the eye and then started letting go with big shots, and then Mark Smith stepped in to stop the fight. But then upon review, it did show that Delija did accidentally poke Cortez Acosta in the eye. And, in a situation like that, you would expect the fight to be listed a no contest and maybe they get a rematch. But they restarted the fight, which is unheard of. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that. Because you got a guy in Ante Delija who's, celebrating a knockout win. He probably had a huge cardio dump, a huge adrenaline dump, going from such a high to dropping down to a low of being like, oh, I still got to keep fighting here? Like, are you kidding me? And then Waldo Acosta, 30 seconds after the fight restarted, drops Delija and eventually finishes him. So I'm willing to give Delija a little bit of a pass there. I'm willing to put an asterisk on that loss against Cortez Acosta. You got to wonder about the energy systems and all of that, the psychological aspect of what that fight was like for Delija. But now he's getting a full training camp going up against a guy like Sergey Spivac, where I think Delija has most of the advantages. Spivac might be able to wear on him a little bit with wrestling, but I believe in Delia's defensive wrestling enough. I believe in his defensive grappling enough to not get stuck in a bad position against Spivac, force him to strike. And I think from there, I think Delija is just a much better striker here. So I'm looking for Spivac to start to break as he can't establish his grappling. I think Delija just starts walking him down, landing big shots, and eventually TKOing him. I could even see this going similar to the Delija and Tybura fight, where Delija knows he can walk Spivac down, and once he lands a few big shots, he might be able to stuff those desperation takedowns and then start walking Spivac down again and landing even bigger shots. And I think that's the approach he's going to take here. And I think that would lead to an Ante Delija TKO win within the first round. I don't know why the line is dropping as much as it is. Delija was about minus 175 late last week. Now he's down to about minus 150. I love it regardless. I think Delija wins, and I think he makes it look quite one-sided as well. All right, next up in the featherweight division, we got veteran Dan Ige coming in at plus 180, going up against the streaking Melquizael Costa, who comes in at minus 210. Starting off on the Dan Ige side of things, this guy is the veteran's veteran, right? This guy goes out there and he's fought the best and the worst that the featherweight division has had to offer him. When he fights the best, probably comes up short. When he fights the middling guys, he goes out there and finishes them. When he's fighting the bottom of the barrel guys, he finishes them even quicker. He's a BJJ black belt, but he often leans on his slick boxing approach to land combinations, outpoint his opponents, and either knock them out or just outpoint them and win a decision. Now he's 2-3 in his last 5 fights, but you can see, the level of guys he's coming up short against and the level of guys he's beating. Knocks out Andre Fili, loses a close decision to Diego Lopez, loses a pretty obvious decision to Lerone Murphy, knocks out Sean Woodson. That was a weird one. I think that fight took place in Toronto as well, but that was a fight where I thought Woodson would be able to outbox Ige from distance, and it was looking that way. But then after the finish happened, it was a little bit of a controversial finish, but finish nonetheless. You get the scorecards, and you see that all 3 judges scored the first 2 rounds for Dan Ige. So they thought that he was doing better work than the sniping approach that Woodson was taking. And then after that, he goes up against Patricio Pitbull. Rough first 2 rounds. It seemed like he was a little bit muzzled by the power that was potentially coming back his way from Pitbull, which allowed Pitbull to land more significant strikes through those first 2 rounds, or at least more impactful shots, the more eye-catching shots. And then Ige started to pick it up in the 3rd round and had a strong 3rd round, but just couldn't muster up enough to get a finish or a 10-8, so he ends up losing a decision that night. He's still 34, so he's still close enough to his prime to, be a solid gatekeeper for the top 15. But we know for sure he's not a guy that's ever going to, be close enough to a title shot or contend for a title by any means. Now he's going up against Melquizael Costa, who is absolutely streaking. He had a breakout 2025. He's on a 5-fight winning streak, 4 of those coming last year, and 2 of those 4 wins being by finish, 3 of those 5 wins being by finish as well. Submitted Andre Fili with the guillotine, stopped most of the takedowns from Christian Rodriguez, and just landed more shots on the feet. I was pretty confident in Christian Rodriguez that night, but I felt if he started leaning more on his striking, he would have had a little bit more success, but he seemed to gas himself a little bit with those desperation takedowns, and Costa played that fight perfectly. Then he gets the decision win over Julian Erosa, and then he knocks out Morgan Charrier to end off his 2025 campaign. That was surprising. I picked Costa to win. I think I bet him that night too. And I just thought his activity level would allow him to get ahead of Charrier. But it was a nasty head kick that ended up dropping the Frenchman and giving the Brazilian the dub there. Now he's getting the biggest fight of his career going up against a veteran like Dan Ige. This is a fight where I believe the nastier shots from Costa, the kicking game from Costa, the activity from Costa will thwart the boxing approach of Ige. Now, Ige could have success if his durability holds up, a guy that's never been finished. If he can crash the pocket and make Costa uncomfortable, maybe he can land some combinations to hurt the Brazilian fighter. So that's what's going to keep me off the chalk from Costa. If Costa drops to about minus 150, minus 185 even, I would probably consider a shot on him there. But I feel like this is a fight where his range could come into play, his kicks will come into play, and he can really batter Ige from distance. I like Costa here, not so much at minus 210, but I still think he ends up landing more significant strikes, the better shots, the more eye-catching shots, and I think that leads to him winning this fight on the scorecards. All right, moving over to the co-main event now. It's in the welterweight division as we have Texas native Jeff Neal coming in at minus 190, going up against Uroš Medić, who comes in at plus 165. Now, starting off on the Neal side of things, he is 2-3 in his last 5 fights, but when you see who the 3 losses are, you're willing to cut him a little bit of slack. He had that knockout victory over Vicente Luque and then was given to Shavkat Rakhmonov and Ian Machado Gary, both fights where I felt he outplayed that big plus money line that he was at, but he was still unable to get the win there. Then he comes back, gets that TKO win over Rafael Dos Anjos. It was an injury, but I believe it was one of the bigger shots that Neal was able to land that caused Dos Anjos to eventually get that injury. So I'm still willing to give that as a legitimate win for Neal. But then last time around ended up, I think it was a spinning back elbow that Prochas landed with like seconds left on the clock in the first round, and that led to Neal getting knocked out. And I think that might have been his first knockout loss in the UFC. But yeah, very, very tough. Now, Neal is one of those guys that, pre-COVID era was one of the best fighters. He had 5 straight wins, 4 knockouts, 2 of those coming against Bilal Muhammad and Mike Perry. And then he was sidelined for a year due to some sort of health issue he was dealing with. And then ever since then, it's been very, inconsistent for him. He's 3-5 since 2020. But I think he is much better than that indicates. I know he's 35 years old, so there's obviously that to consider. But when he's at his best, he's one of the nastier strikers with good power, good speed, good combinations, good range management as well. And we know he has a very nasty head kick as well. The way he was able to knock out Mike Perry, it was a thing of beauty, especially when you consider how good of a durability game that Mike Perry has as well. So for Jeff Neal to knock out a guy like that was very, very impressive. I still think Neal has some high-level wins left in him, and I think being in a spot here against Uroš Medić could really buoy him, especially fighting in Houston. Now, Medić kind of streaking right now, too. He's on a 2-fight winning streak. He was a guy earlier in his career I was having trouble in terms of figuring out whether he was going to win or lose, but now I'm 5-0 in terms of betting his last 5 fights. I bet him to lose to Oralbai. I bet him to beat Tim Means. And then in his last 3 fights, I bet the under, I believe it was, or I bet Puna. I think I bet Puna and then the under in his last 2 fights, and it's all worked out for me. Yeah, I bet the under in the Urbina and Salikov fights. And, that just goes to show this is a guy that does a phenomenal job in terms of implementing his range and his power. In 15 pro fights, he's never seen the scorecards. He's only reached the third round once, and that was against Matthew Summelsberger, and he was able to get the finish halfway through that round. He's a nasty Muay Thai specialist with great shots down the middle, especially with his left hand. His durability is still a bit of a question mark. I think we saw it obviously exposed by Punahele Soriano, but we know Soriano is a big puncher, especially when he can blitz into those big shots. And his grappling defense has been a little bit of an issue in his game, even in fights he ended up winning. He's often down early due to these guys out grappling him, but then he's able to outlast them and then eventually finish them as well. He's long and lanky for the division, and in this matchup specifically, he'll hold a 2-inch height advantage as well. Actually, he won't have a reach advantage. Neal is actually pretty long. He'll have a 4-inch reach advantage over Medic. This is a fun striking battle, one that I don't expect to hit the third round. I expect Neal's craftier striking game to really catch Medic and put him away. I don't think Medic can apply the type of pressure that Praches was able to do against Neal. I think, it's going to take a crazy shot from Medic to put Neal away, like a spinning back elbow or something like that. I'm sure Neal is going to keep that in mind going into this fight and whenever he enters the range against Medic. But I think it's just a matter of time before Neal lands that big shot, before Neal crumples Medic and eventually gets that knockout win. I don't mind him at this chalky -190 line either. I just think he's so much better than Medic. If his chin is gone, I'm willing to eat that loss there, but I think that Neal should be able to land that big shot on Medic here and eventually put him away. I think it happens in round 1. I'd be surprised if this reaches round 3, but I think Neal wins pretty easily here, and I think he gets the knockout. All right, that brings us to the main event for this UFC Houston card now, and it goes down between former middleweight champion Sean Strickland, who comes in at plus 235, and rising contender Anthony Fluffy Hernandez, who comes in at minus 275. Now, Strickland is coming off of a title fight loss to Dricus du Plessis. That was a fight, again, a rematch. The first fight, Strickland was able to, or actually ended up losing his title to Dricus in a very close fight. I think it was a split decision loss. Pretty much came down to the last round, but du Plessis was able to just edge that one out. Strickland ended up bouncing back with a 5-round co-main event decision win over Paulo Costa, showcasing what Strickland is best at, walking opponents down, landing a barrage of shots, staying high with the output, showcasing good cardio, and just wearing opponents out that way. But then unfortunately, his last fight against Dricus du Plessis, not the best Strickland we've seen. We saw du Plessis actually have a much better performance against Strickland, pretty much beating him 4-1 on all scorecards, and we saw du Plessis get that win there to retain the title. But Strickland, a guy that you can never really count out, even at 34 years old, former welterweight, had a lot of success at middleweight, got him to a title shot, got him the title by pulling off that big upset against Israel Adesanya, but now he's seeming to struggle against, du Plessis, the main guy who's kind of had his number at 185 pounds. I think the other guy that beat him at 185 was Alex Pereira as well. I think Jared Cannonier just won a very close decision against him too. But Strickland's game is largely predicated on him establishing his pace and pressure, walking opponents down, working the body, utilizing a very weird striking defense game, but it works out pretty well for him. And that allows him to just walk guys down, land with pace and pressure, break guys down, utilize his cardio, weaponize his cardio as best as he can. And that often causes opponents a lot of issues. And his takedown defense has held up quite well. Guys have struggled to hold him down. Just for an example, Dricus du Plessis landed 6 takedowns in their first fight and was only able to accrue 2 minutes of control time over the 25 minutes they fought each other. The only guy to really have grappling success against Strickland was years and years ago when he took on Kamaru Usman, who was able to control him for the majority of that fight. I think he controlled him for 8 minutes or something like that. But since that being at middleweight, it's been tough. That's obviously going to get challenged here as he takes on Anthony Fluffy Hernandez, who has been absolutely streaking as of late and is now on an 8-fight winning streak. He's, I believe, headlined his last 3 cards. The first of which was a mauling of Michel Pereira. Then he goes, he did headline the Brendan Allen fight. That was I think a co-main event or somewhere on a main card. He was able to outwork Brendan Allen. And then the last headlining fight that he had against Roman Delija, beat him from pillar to post, eventually submitting him. I think he submitted him with like a bulldog choke or even like a rear naked choke with no hooks in. He just beat the shit out of Roman Delija that night. But that's Hernandez's game. If you guys have been following me for the past several years, I think even back in 2020, I used to call Anthony Fluffy Hernandez the poor man's Cain Velasquez, a guy that wrestles and wrestles and wrestles, and he doesn't care whether his opponents work back to their feet, because it's almost harder for opponents to work back to their feet, to only get taken back down again, and then being forced to work back to their feet. And Fluffy did it perfectly, just like Velasquez would be able to do to the heavyweights back in the day. Hernandez can do that very effectively, and that's why we see him going out there and just dominating these guys. The issues that he's had in the past is his durability, specifically to the body, right? Marcus Perez was able to hurt him to the body and submit him, kind of club and subbing him there. The other loss, his last loss, came to Kevin Holland, who was able to hurt him to the body and eventually get a finish there too. Since then, Hernandez seems to have done a great job in terms of working on his core, working on his durability, eating big shots from guys like Edmund Shabazian, Roman Kopylov, and Michel Pereira, and still being able to push forward and apply his trade. And I think that is what is giving a lot of people confidence here, making him a big favorite against Sean Strickland. Now, the issue becomes, will it be the striking pace of Sean Strickland or the grappling pace of Anthony Hernandez? I would be very surprised if either guy ends up gassing out here. If one guy does, I think it might be Hernandez. If he's unable to establish dominant positions, or if he can't get that, the cage back ride that he loves to work on opponents, keeping them on their knees, pushing forward from that back position, if he can't keep Strickland there and Strickland can break off enough and continuously work forward, use some body work, maybe that's how he breaks Hernandez down and, either wins a decision or breaks him late and gets a TKO. But I'm believing in Hernandez's improvements, and I'm believing in his ability to find those positions to stay safe. And even if Strickland works out of those positions, I think it's going to take him longer than it has against prior opponents to do so. And I think that leads to Hernandez just getting those pockets of time of control, landing takedowns, threatening with submissions. I think both guys are going to struggle to finish the other. And I have to lean with Fluffy getting the win here. Would I take him at chalk against Strickland? Probably not. The spot that does intrigue me, though, is the over 4.5 around that minus 120 line. I think it's going to be hard for either guy to finish the other, and I think that leads to this fight hitting the scorecards, and it just comes down to whether Hernandez can hold Strickland and land enough damage, or Strickland getting away and landing his output. I think it's going to be the former. I think it's going to be Hernandez, grappling, control, submission attempts, decision win, and probably a shot at the title now. I'm going Anthony Fluffy Hernandez by decision. There you guys go. Full UFC Houston breakdown for you guys there. I always cap off these podcasts now by recapping the past events between now and when I did my last prediction breakdown, which was for the UFC Vegas 113 card. So we've had a few events happen between then. So I'm going to quickly run down those cards. The first of which, we had an exceptional night for LFA 226 where we took 5 underdog shots. You don't see one on the screen there, but there was one that BetMMA.tips did not post. It was Blake Mitchell at plus 130 that I was able to cash as well. We hit Joseph Cropshot, who wins the title, pulling off upset as a plus 350 underdog. We hit on Dedrick Sanders, who knocks out his opponent in the third round, plus 175. Alexander Shank submits his opponent as a plus 275 underdog. The Trevin Eller and Zane Havener under 1.5, minus 210 chalky. And I actually thought it was going to be Eller that gets the win, but Havener ends up cashing the under 1.5 for us. So I'm happy about that rather than taking the minus 1,000 that Eller was at. And then Mackenzie Stiller gets the position I fully expected her to get. She gets the tap out and cashes the under 1.5 for us at plus 115. So all in all, plus 9.8 units, whatever that is, 150, 160% ROI. Absolutely killed it on LFA 226. So I'm very happy about that. Then the next day, we had PFL Dubai, and we were doing pretty well to start off most of the card, but then we end up shit in the bed, largely due to Shamil Musayev. Now, I still haven't seen the fight. I refuse to watch the fight. I have no idea how a guy who, to me, looked as good as Shamil Musayev did lose to a guy in Ramazan Kuramagomedov who I've never really rated that high. I was big on the under 2.5. That doesn't end up cashing. I was even had him in a parlay. That doesn't end up cashing. Somehow Carl Williams ends up surviving longer than I expected him to against Romani, and Romani gets the finish in, I believe, in the second round, but the under 1.5 does not cash. We do hit on Salamat Izbulayev, who TKOs Jesus Pinedo. We cash on Makar Sharip Zainukov, who cashes at minus 175, and then Denise Keelholz, who probably should have been the lock of the night play, but I was a little bit concerned considering she was just coming back from giving birth. She goes out there and dominates Antonia Silvanide as a minus 160 favorite. So all in all for PFL Dubai, we go down minus 5.85 units, giving back, half of the profit that we got from the LFA card the day before. But luckily, we have a tremendous UFC card. We pretty much swept the predictions. We went 11 of 11 on the actual fights, and then the 2 new fights that got added on during fight week. We go 1-1 there. We end up losing on Nico Price, but we won the other fight, Javid Bashrat against Yanni Vasquez. But in terms of betting, we did pretty well. We'd lose on a dog shot on Marc-Andre Barrios, 0.5 units at plus 376. That was a fight where if you told me the fight was going to go into the third round, and that's around that Oleg Shejak won by deciding the fight, I would call you crazy. But credit to Oleg Shejak in terms of the body work that he put in those first 2 rounds, even though he lost the second round. But I thought it was a decent shot, plus 376. And, Barrios definitely fought for our money there. Unfortunately, can't get over the finish line. Nico Price, chin is gone. I'm willing to write him off now. But I still thought pre-fight plus 250 was just crazy as hell. And then the Cachoeira Shigula fight under 2.5. Kind of surprised that Shigula didn't go for the grappling more than I was expecting her to. And she just goes out there and outstrikes Cachoeira. But the dubs, lock of the night hits. Mario Bautista dominates Vinicius Oliveira, gets the win there. Dog of the night, Rizvan Kuniev goes out there. Kind of a boring fight, but went exactly as I thought it would. Jailton would struggle on the takedowns, and then Kuniev would get the better of most of the striking exchanges and then get the better of some of the clinch exchanges. He cashes as a plus 135 dog. We also cash on Jakub Vikwac, plus 110. Gets the last second submission win over Muin Gafarov, but even if that fight hit the scorecards, they released the scorecards, Vikwac still would have won a decision. So we get the dub there. Dustin Jacoby, minus 195 against Julius Walker, absolutely demolishes him. Could have been a lock of the night play for us as well. And then our parlay with Kong Wang, that fight playing out a lot closer than I thought against Eduardo Mora. Luckily, she gets the win. And then Kyoji Horiguchi goes out there and dominates Amir Albazi, cashing us a minus 145 parlay. So all in all, plus 6.87 units. It was a fantastic weekend outside of that PFL fumble, but LFA and UFC cash big for us. So we're able to start off February on the right foot. And then just this past weekend, no UFC events, no LFA events, but there was Octagon, a promotion I don't cover as deeply as I used to. But this spot here with Fedor Doric coming in at minus 133 against the dangerous Thomas Mudrock, I felt that was one that we needed to take advantage of, and it pays off. 1.33 units for a 1 unit profit. So solid run since the last UFC card is what I'm trying to say here. But this weekend, we got UFC Houston going down, and then we also have Cage Warriors 200, their bicentennial event going down February 21st, so the morning of UFC Houston. I'll be covering Cage Warriors for you guys. I will probably drop that breakdown for you guys on Friday, so stay tuned for that. But we have a big UFC event coming down this weekend. KSW is also going down Saturday morning. I'll skim that card. If there's something that catches my eye, I'll be dropping it for the Lock of the Night Patreon, folks. So if you want to get all the tracked plays, make sure you guys check out the MMA Lock of the Night Patreon page. Link for that in the description below. Man, we ran long for this podcast, but I'm just happy to be back in the saddle here to break down these fights. All right, I will catch you guys again tomorrow for the Tuesday live stream, 8 p.m. Eastern to 9 p.m. Eastern. Make sure you guys join me right here on the YouTube channel, and I'll take all your questions, comments, and concerns for UFC Houston, for Cage Warriors, and any other relevant news going down in the MMA world. Hope to catch most of you guys then. See you then. Peace.
Last thing.